Al?
Can I hear you?
Can y'all hear me?
Al is
Thank
present.
you. Thank you, Al. Okay. Anita?
I'm here.
Anthony Edwards?
I'm here.
Andy Castillo? Anna Marie?
I'm here.
Kurt? Dana?
Dana's here.
Okay, thank you. Dee Dee?
I'm here.
Thank you. Jack?
Jack is here.
Thank you. Jim? John?
John Agatha's here.
Thank you. Michael Kinnick?
Present.
Thank you. Michael Sanchez?
He's here.
Thank you. Norm?
I'm here.
Thank you. Dr. Femi?
I'm here.
Thank you. Peter?
I'm here.
Thank you. Seymour?
I'm here.
Thank you. And Wayne?
I'm
And Henry's
Okay.
here too now. I'm here on the
Perfect.
I'm here on the phone. He still hadn't got the WebEx thing fixed.
Okay.
And Jim Berg is here.
Perfect. Thank you. All right. Reed, we do have a quorum. So we can get, if you have opening remarks, you can do that if you would like.
No, yeah, just got a couple. Fortunately, y'all won't have to look at me tonight. I just can join by phone because I don't know what. Anyway, we're going to try to use the same procedure tonight that we used last week, where during the presentations, please put your questions in the chat. Once we get to the end, and I didn't hear because I was still trying to join, do we have people signed up to speak tonight?
Yes, sir. We have 2 people signed up to speak tonight.
Okay, so we will still have quite a bit of time. When it comes to the point in the slides where there's question and answer, you know, please feel free to speak in a dialogue if you need to with whoever's answering the questions. But during the presentations, let's try to let the presenters get through it and then hold your questions, and they'll be accumulating them. That's all I have, Ann. So let's, I guess we got to get started on this.
Okay. Eloisa, did you have any opening remarks?
No, I did not. I just wanted to make sure that you got me on my audio. Had gone out for like a quick minute there, and I didn't see you catch my name.
I got you, ma'am. I could see you, but thank you.
Thank you.
Okay,
Good evening,
Chad, I'm going to turn it over to you then.
All right, thanks, Ann. Adrian, if you don't mind bringing up our first presentation, it's the CPS Energy short one. Good evening, everybody. Excited to have you back. I'm excited to be back. Just like I've done the past couple of meetings, I'm going to take just a few minutes at the front of this meeting to kind of level set where we are and where we're headed next. If you'll turn to, slide 3. Let's go on to slide 3. So this is the same roadmap slide that we've shared each of the last 2 meetings, with the exception, with the one difference that we continue to check away our different topics. So we've been through most of the rate design topics. Tonight, we're going to talk about cost and how that relates to rate making. I'll talk a little bit more about that on the next slide. But next is when we're going to jump into CPS Energy information. I know y'all are very interested in that. We know that. We hear it every time. The stuff we've been talking about is foundational to those important conversations that we're about to have. So I'm going to ask for your patience one more night. If you'll turn to the next slide, Adrian. We are going to work on some ideas to be very interactive for the next several meetings, but tonight is sort of the last of 3 Brattle Group presentations where we've got an outside expert who's going to come and talk about how utilities do some stuff. Specifically, it's cost of service and how that impacts rate design and rate making. And you know, I like this topic. I think it's interesting and maybe even riveting, I would say, but I'm not like everybody, and there may be some of you out there who don't feel the same way. So I wanted to just explain why it's relevant to you. Why does it matter to the RAC? In the next couple of weeks, we are going to be talking about the top issues that you are all interested in. And we can't talk about those issues without a foundational understanding of how cost is driven into our business and how that translates to the prices that we charge our customers. So when we talk about fairness or equity across the different customer segments, are people paying the right prices? The cost of service matters. When we talk about affordability, whether that's comparing ourselves to other utilities in the state or thinking about our limited income segment here in San Antonio, the cost of providing their service matters. If we're talking about sustainability and renewable energy and driving and incentivizing renewable energy, the way solar customers, rooftop solar customers, drive cost into our business matters for how we set rates. And of course, for general financial stability, how we set rates based on our cost really matters. So I'd encourage you to just hang in there, pay attention for one more evening of a lecture series, and then we'll get to the really, really good stuff in 2 weeks. Reed said that we're going to handle this the same way that we handled the last time. Ann and I are monitoring the chat, and so we will respond when there's a short question. We'll try and just type in a response. So be very forthcoming with your questions. The gentleman that's going to speak tonight is Augie Roz, and again, he's a Brattle Group individual. He's going to be talking through the content, but I'm sort of monitoring the chat, and I'll either interrupt him or I'll speak up, and one of us will answer questions as they go. We do have a pause in here every few slides for questions. So I think we'll have kind of the same experience that we had last time. One more note of housekeeping before we turn it over to Augie. The Q&A online inventory. So we've got about 30-ish questions that you have asked over the last 3 or 4 weeks posted on our website, and we've answered about a third of those. It's time-consuming to do it. We do a little bit each day. We will eventually get to all of them, but I would very much, I very much encourage you to go out there and look at the responses that we've put on the website to the questions that you've been asking. Okay, and with that, I will turn it over to Augie.
Great, thanks, Chad. Yeah, if you can bring up the slide, that would be great.
Okay, it is loading, sir. It should be up momentarily.
Perfect. And just to start off, so we're going to be talking about the cost of service today in rate making, and it's not going to be a standalone topic, as Chad mentioned. We're talking about this because it relates to how ultimately rates are made. So, so what we'll be talking about deals with not only costs in the electricity sector, but specifically how you turn those costs into rates and how those rates are different for the different customer classes and different customer types. So we'll be looking at things like how costs arise, what are the main cost drivers, and the levels of costs. And specifically, we want to try to always bring it to how this eventually goes to rates for the different customer classes. The presentation is high level. We know there's different backgrounds in terms of the RAC members. So we tried to keep it at a pretty high level. Obviously, we're not expecting anybody to become an expert in cost of service over just one 90-minute period. And we are going to go into a little bit of detail in terms of the steps involved and how those steps lead to rates. And what we're certainly happy to, we're going to be stopping for Q&As throughout the presentation, but there very well could be other questions that perhaps are more detailed, and we would be happy to deal with those questions in other ways through emails or anything like that. There's some more detailed questions as well. One thing I want to say, all the numbers in the presentation are hypothetical. As Chad mentioned, eventually these concepts will be brought to CPS specific information. But for this high-level discussion, we are keeping it hypothetical in terms of the actual numbers. We're developing numbers so that you see how they flow through to the different parts of cost of service and ultimately rate making, but these are hypothetical numbers. Okay, if we can go to the next slide. So there's 4 sections of the agenda. We're going to start off with just some electricity cost basics and concepts. These are items that we believe are crucial for just having a basic understanding of how costs arise in the electricity sector, what are the most important types of costs, and ultimately how they're relevant for rate making, and also relevant for many of the things we've been talking about in the last couple of sessions, and relevant for some of the main drivers of what's going in what's happening with the electricity industry today. It's kind of the changes occurring, the technological changes occurring, and fundamentally how costs are important and all that. So that's going to be the first part of the agenda. The second part is going to be talking about where cost of service fits within the rate making process. As Chad mentioned, it's one step and it's an important step. But in this section, we'll be talking about things like the revenue requirement, which is a fundamental component of cost of service. You need the revenue requirement to come up with what the individual costs are, and then turning those costs into rates. We'll talk about cost of service at a very high level. What are the main steps involved? And then we'll have one slide with rate making, but with the understanding that we've talked a little bit about rate making already. And at the end of this presentation, we'll have more slides that turn the specific costs that we're going to go and discuss today into specific rates. The third step, the third part of the agenda is there's about 3 main steps in a cost of service study, and we'll be going through each of those steps. Again, at a very high level, but this is probably the main part of the presentation where we discuss specifically the costs and how they're turned into rates. And then the last section is taking the cost for the different customer classes and again, turning those costs into rates. As Chad mentioned, we have slides, kind of placeholders for question and answers, which we'll be developing as we go through. So as you have questions, please write them down in the chat box. And at the end of the section, there'll be a question and answer slide, and we'll be able to answer your questions and even have a discussion in those sections. Next slide, please. Okay. So the importance of electricity cost and rate making and policy. So as we talked about a couple of weeks ago, we've been talking about rate design, and really achieving a good understanding of rate design principles and best practices requires a basic knowledge of electricity costs and how those costs result in rates that consumers pay. So there were several principles of rate design that were talked about, and 2 of them had to do with cost. Specifically, rate design should be cost reflective. So how exactly do you measure cost reflectiveness? How do you determine what is a cost reflective rate? And we hope after this presentation, will have a basic understanding of how that's generally done. If the rate is cost reflective, it implicitly is that it was allocated fairly, that the electricity costs were allocated fairly among the different rate classes. And we'll talk about the different parts of a cost of service study where that comes about. Like, what is the methodology one uses in determining whether costs are allocated fairly among the different customer classes. The basic part of electricity costing is what we call an electricity cost of service study, called a COSS. It could be an Excel-based program, an analysis. It could be a more sophisticated analysis. But all utilities that set electricity rates use some type or develop some type of cost of service study. Small utilities, large utilities, in many instances, the cost of service studies are in a regulatory proceeding are litigated. You may have even a regulatory commission that develops its own cost of service study. You could have interveners. And so, but the foundational part of electricity rates and whether the rates are fair, whether they're cost reflective, and ultimately whether they're just and reasonable comes down to a cost of service study. Now, this also is, it's not just a principle that we've talked about a couple of weeks ago with respect to, you know, what are the main principles of rate design. In the United States, these are judicial opinions. I was working on another proceeding today and came across a quote from the U.S. Court of Appeals for it was a transmission proceeding that was occurring, and there was a quote that I thought was very relevant to, you know, what we're discussing here. The quote is, "A properly designed rates should produce revenues from each class of customers which match as closely as practicable the cost to serve each class or individual customer." And then it continues, while the commission, and this is referring to the FERC, while the commission is not requesting to apply exacting precision in rate making, costs must be allocated roughly commensurate with benefits. Okay, so I thought that was a good quote to say that this is a judicial kind of opinion as well. In many jurisdictions, whether rates are just and reasonable depends on the underlying cost and the underlying cost study and the underlying cost allocation methodologies. Now, specifically, an electricity cost of service study can help answer the following types of, you know, specific questions, which we'll get into a little bit later on. As I mentioned, just how are the costs of electricity assets that all customer classes utilize, how are those allocated? And, you know, that's the fundamental problem in electricity rate making and in rate making in many industries where there's significant fixed costs. You have assets that are used by many different customer groups. And the question is how to allocate those assets. What methodology does one use to allocate those assets? And is it done in a fair way? You know, so what are some of the standards that one uses for that? In terms of other additional questions that cost of service study will answer, some of it directly, some of it indirectly, are things like, you know, what are the cost differences between current generation technologies, like fossil fuel technologies, and newer generation technologies like renewable energy? Those that question can be answered in a cost of service study, as the cost of service study will look at the different generation technologies and get all the cost components, and one can look at what the differences are. So that's another type of question, a relevant question that one can answer through a cost of service study. And then one that is particularly interested in as new technologies are developing, what happens to the utilities cost when customers deploy solar PV? storage, or other behind the meter technologies. A cost of service study can give you some answers to those type of questions. Okay, next slide, please. So, and I was thinking about what are some of the major concepts that would be the most useful to this group and trying to get a good handle on in terms of getting a basic understanding of electricity costs. And two to come to mind is, one is just an understanding of the electricity system. What are the major components? Generation, transmission, distribution, and how do the costs differ? How are they the same in those components? Okay, so having a good understanding of that, I think, is very important. The second is making sure you have a good understanding of two fundamental concepts of electricity usage, and that is the difference between a kilowatt and a kilowatt hour. Now, throughout this presentation, understanding that difference will be essential and very important, and we'll talk about that. But these are fundamental cost drivers of the electricity sector. And when we talk about how allocation is done, what is typically done is you allocate the cost based on customers' usage. And so having a good understanding of the different type of customer usage is very important. So in the next two slides, we'll talk about these two concepts. Next slide, please. Okay. So here we have a graphical representation of a typical electricity system, right? And these are the components that give rise to electricity costs. You have three main components of the electricity system. You have generation, you have transmission, and you have distribution. Okay. So what I put down here is the percent of costs that each component typically comprises in an electricity system. Now, this is an average based on my work over time, my understanding. This is very much dependent on the utility. So you could have situations where utility share of generation is less than what's shown here, and in some situations it could be more. But normally about 50 to 60% of the electricity system's cost is due to generation. And generation can mean either the company-owned generation, their plant and equipment, as well as purchase power that the utility needs to purchase in order to provide service. So that's the first component. And then you see there, just FYI, that generation is usually generated at a very low voltage, and then it's stepped up, increased, because in the transmission portion of the electricity system, it's much more efficient to transmit electricity through very high voltage rather than lower voltage. So typically you have a step-up transformer that increases the voltage. Transmission is, in terms of cost, it's a relatively low percentage of the cost. It could be anywhere between 5 to 15%. And again, that depends on the type of utility. And then the last component is the distribution component, which can be anywhere from 20 to 40% of the cost. Now here's the fundamental challenge or objective of a cost of service study. You see those three customers, the residential, commercial, industrial customers. They all are served by the same, in this picture, they're all served by the same generation plant. So somehow all the cost of the generation plant has to be allocated to those three customers. And it's going to be done in a way that's fair and that's representative of cost causation. Same thing with the transmission grid. If you see the transmission system there, all three customers use the transmission system in order to receive energy. And then when you get down to the distribution system, you can see that Now, all three customer used, and the distribution system is broken down between primary and secondary. You can see that all three customers use the primary distribution because the energy has to flow through it. But then when you get down to the secondary distribution, only the residential and commercial customers use that component of the distribution system. You see in this picture, the industrial customer doesn't use that component of the distribution system. And so in a cost of service study, that industrial customer wouldn't be allocated any of the cost of secondary distribution because they're not using it. So that is, a reality of a cost of service study, that you're assigned cost only if you use part of the electricity system. And we have to kind of find a way where the cost of these assets are allocated to the different customer classes. And the way we do that is based on some measure of usage, okay? Which brings us to the next slide, which talks about the two different usages in electricity. So,
Augie, this is Chad.
Yeah.
Quick question for you. There's
Yeah.
a question on the chat, and I realize I'm not 100% sure on the answer. What you're showing here on slide 4 is really more fixed costs, right? There's no sort of fuel or variable costs.
well, in order to generate electricity, you're going to need the fuel costs. You're going to need those variable costs. And I'll get that. I'll show that in a couple of slides. But you don't see the fuel there, but you can assume that there's fuel in that generation plant.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. And so cost of service studies tends to allocate the cost based on usage. So that's why it's important to have a good understanding of what are the usages in electricity. So we go to the next slide, and you'll see there's really two, and it's important to have a good understanding of these two. One is energy, and the other is capacity, capacity/demand. Let me start with the capacity first, because I think it's intuitively makes more sense to start there and then go to energy. So the capacity is a measure of the instantaneous amount of power needed. So an electricity company needs to have a certain amount of capacity in order to meet the instantaneous peak demand. Whether that peak demand happens in the summer, whether that happens in the winter, that's a measure. That's a measure of that's called capacity, and that's a measure of usage. For example, a typical residential customer, if you take and you look at the year where they have the most demand at any given point in time, that could be correlated with the system peak. That is a measure of how much electricity that residential customer needs at one point of time. And that's called a capacity measure in electricity, and it's measured by kilowatts. Energy is the quantity of power over time, and we refer to it as the work performed. Okay, and so it is how much energy do you need over time. You can think of 1 hour of power is 1 hour's worth of work, because you're providing power to supply a piece of equipment, and it's generating work. Electricity is generating work in order to power that equipment. So, for example, work is termed energy. So when you see energy, it's work. And the example is if you have 10 100-watt fans operating for 1 hour, that needs 1 kilowatt hour of energy. Whereas power is an instantaneous measure. Okay, and just a little nuance: when you're talking about power from the supply side, it's referred to as capacity. When you're talking about power from the customer's perspective about how much they need, it's called demand. So that's why it's a little bit confusing, but sometimes you'll see capacity/demand measuring or meaning the same thing. So these two usages, as I mentioned earlier, we're going to use the usage in order to allocate cost. And these two measures are what we call cost drivers, because this is what gives rise to electricity costs. And if you go to the next slide, there is one more cost driver. So so we just talked about energy. In order to provide more energy on a system, you're going to incur certain cost. And so we refer to the energy as a cost driver. If you need to provide more capacity, you're also going to need more cost. So we refer to demand as another cost driver. And then we also identify in a cost of service study, or we use commonly, a third driver of electricity costs, which is customers. That is, so the more customers you need, or you have to hook up, the more costs you incur. So those are the three cost drivers in an electricity system that are crucial in a cost of service study, that then are reflected in rates, in your rates, and what you have in your bill. So we'll step through this in a few slides, but that energy related component, we're gonna take the revenue requirement and try to get it into how much of that is energy related, and that's going to be the basis of an energy charge. How much of that is demand related, that's going to be the basis of the demand charge, and then how much of that is customer related, and that's going to be the basis of a customer charge. Two final concepts that are relevant here is the difference between a variable cost and fixed cost. And I think, Chad, this is kind of the question you mentioned earlier. So if we look at the energy related, what specifically are we talking about? What kind of costs are energy related? So what kind of costs change when you require additional kilowatt hour of energy? Those tend to be the variable costs, because they're variable with respect to kilowatt hours. And those are things like the fuel necessary, and even like wholesale power purchases. Those are all examples of the variable cost. So we want to look at the revenue requirement and find where in the revenue requirement we have those cost items and term those as energy costs, but they're also variable costs from a cost of service perspective. The demand related cost and the customer related costs typically are referred to as fixed cost, and that's fixed with respect to additional kilowatt hours. That is, if you have a system operating and it's got enough capacity, and you have an increase in kilowatt hours, you don't have any additional demand costs. Same thing with customers. You're not adding any additional customers. So it's typical in cost of service studies that the energy related component of the cost are referred to as variable costs, and the other two components, the demand related and customer related, are referred to as fixed costs. And that's going to be extremely important because that's an incredibly relevant debate that we're having today, and we've had for a while, about what is an efficient rate design. And as you're developing and implementing new technologies and new customer options, it's really important to have a good understanding of if something is implemented, what is the impact of the company on its variable cost, and what are the impact on the company on its fixed cost. And this next slide here provides a little bit more of this point. And then after that, there's a slide for questions and answer. We can turn to any questions. So you may have remembered this was a slide like this was put up a couple of weeks ago, which depicts the kind of the problem in rate design. And here I'm just adding the concept of fixed versus variable cost distinction. So you see where the utility cost column is, it's showing, if I take my revenue requirement and I categorize what amount of the revenue requirement is a variable cost, like fuel, gas supply, also variable O&M, it's $60. What amount of that is customer cost, like meters, billing systems, is $10. And then what amount of the utility cost is a demand component? I forgot to mention the demand costs are what we call the capital investment. So the capital associated with generation, that's a demand component because it's getting to capacity. Yeah, the size of that, how much generation you need, depends on how much demand your customers, capacity demand your customers have. Same thing with distribution, same thing with transmission. So in this example, if we assume $60 is variable cost, $10 is a fixed customer, and $50 is fixed capacity or demand cost, that's the cost characteristic of this utility. Now, many people argue, economists argue, and not all, and there are exceptions, that the best rate design then is one that perfectly mimics your utilities cost. So for some, they would say you would then have a variable charge that recovers at $60. You would have a customer charge that recovers at $10, and then you would have a demand charge that recovers at $50. Okay. However, and I think we talked about this a couple of weeks ago, but this is important to emphasize, for residential customers, typically that's not the case. Typically, you only have two components. You've got a variable component and you got a customer component. And just to make sure you're clear on what a variable component is, that is, the typical residential electricity bill is the more kilowatts you use, the higher your bill goes. The less kilowatts, the lower your bill is. But it's recovering everything. It's recovering your fixed costs as well. It's recovering not only your variable costs, it's recovering your fixed costs as well. And so the typical residential rate design, when they refer to it as a variable rate design, that's what it's referring to. That the variable component there you see there in the customer bills, it's recovering $115 of the utilities cost. So it's recovering not only the $60, but it's also recovering $55 of fixed cost. So this becomes important when we talk about, well, what happens when a customer has, say, solar PV on the system or energy efficiency? What impact does that have on the utilities cost, right? And so as you consume more or less kilowatt hours, the customer rates change, but the cost of the utility doesn't necessarily change commensurate with that, unless your rate design was perfectly aligned, where your variable charge was completely related to your variable cost, and your customer charge was perfectly related to your customer cost, and you had a demand charge. Typically, residential customers do not have demand charges. So, let's go to the next slide is a Q&A. Let me just pause there and see if there's any chat, if there's any questions or anything else we need to answer.
Well, we've been trying to keep up with them in the chat, but does anybody have any questions that they just want to speak up and talk through?
Yeah, hi. I have an overview clarification question. I just want to make sure that I have a good understanding of overall and thank you, Chad. You did a great job of answering a lot of our questions in the chat and while you're giving the presentation. My clarification question is under our entire umbrella of our cost of service expenses for CPS Energy specifically. My understanding is that one is operations, which is that generation, transmission, and distribution. I know that's oversimplification. Second is our debt that we carry. Third is our R&R or repair and replace. The fourth is our payment to the city of San Antonio, and fifth is our remaining R&R. And I just want to make sure, is that a good overview if that's what goes into our expenses?
Yeah, what you're referring to is what we call the flow of funds, and there's an order in which we cover our expenses. the O&M piece being expenses, I think that also includes, for purposes of the flow of funds, also includes our fuel expense. So it's hard to sort of lay the flow of funds over this fixed versus variable conversation because they don't, they don't sort of map up the right way, if that makes sense.
Yes, thank you very much.
Yeah, and as we continue, I think we get into a little bit more of those breakdowns and how they come about. And actually, the next slide.
If I may ask a question.
Yeah, sure.
And this is more to Chad. I know, just going back to page 7, I'm sorry, my video, for some reason, it's not working quite well. So I guess you all can hear me. On slide 7, I remember we had a previous slide that showed this illustration, and I'm glad you've made an adjustment that actually makes it more visually illustrative. But I also, if you recall, Chad, I had said it might help to show this on a timeline. Because one of the things that I think we're trying to capture here is the fact that if someone looks at this, and this is more from a stakeholder engagement point of view, should you need to do this in the future, it appears as if, oh, well, on a total to total basis, you're meeting your costs. So why are we talking about variable versus fixed? But if presented on a timeline, and I've seen this before, which is why I'm saying this, there comes a point where you might almost see the period of time when the variable component sort of dips below the utilities fixed component. That dip is usually where the problem is, to my understanding, because then you're visually seeing that you're not able to meet your fixed costs with the variable utility component of the customer's bill. So a timeline helps illustrate that very clearly because we can see over time how that dip occurs. Maybe sometime in the future when we get to the actual real numbers, we might be able to see this, hopefully, with some of the examples coming from our customer classes in San Antonio. But I thought I'll just throw that in because it helps to illustrate why we're so concerned about matching the fixed components of the customer's bill with the fixed components of the utility costs, and similarly for the variable components.
Yeah, I think that's going to be a compelling visual. And one of the things Augie will show is load profile over time on a timeline of the different customer types. And so one of the things we'll look at in coming weeks is how the load profile of a residential customer changes when they get rooftop solar, because we build the system for, their maximum, peak pulling of kW, of kilowatt hours.
Right.
But when they get solar, it dips for that period of time because they're getting their energy from solar, not from us. So their peak may change a little and go down a little, and it may shift on the timeline a little bit, but our fixed costs, we still incur fixed costs to serve that new peak point. And so that's what Augie meant when he said that when you get solar, the reduction in your variable costs is not necessarily commensurate with a reduction in your fixed costs.
Right. Okay, I get it. I appreciate the explanation, and I think that will be something that would be nice to see with such a solar example when we get to that point.
So,
yes, sir.
To this point about the rooftop units and the customer's bill, so when the variable costs go down, as you say, because of the rooftop things, but the fixed charges don't go down, how does the rate, issue handle that, and what happens to the allocation of those costs? Is that part of how you do a rate analysis, and how does that, somebody has to pay that cost, who does? And I mean, how is that considered in the overall picture for what percentage of in this particular case rooftop units are brought online, and what does that do to the overall cost of the utility, and how is that allocated, and how is it paid for? Is that a fair question that has to go into thinking about how we do rates?
Yes. So let me give an example, sort of a metaphor. If I have a swimming pool and I need to fill it with water, I can fill it with a garden hose and it'll take a day and a half to fill, or I can have the water utility install a 12-inch water main and I'll fill it in about 10 minutes. My fixed cost is the cost of that equipment, the garden hose or the pipe, to get it into my pool. My variable cost is the water in the pool. So let's say I'm a residential customer and I have a garden hose and I'm paying the water utility for the cost of the garden hose, but then I drill a well next to my pool and I'm getting some water out of the ground on my own and pouring it into the pool. Well, I don't have to buy as much water from the water utility, but I still have to cover the cost of the garden hose, because there's times when my well isn't generating enough water for me and I need some water from the water utility. So that's the issue right there. And you know, the rate alignment with that is what creates problems. So the residential rate, our residential rate is an $8.75 monthly fixed base charge. And it's roughly 9 or 10 cents of energy charge per kilowatt hour. So that's where you get to the 7% fixed charges on the bill and 93% variable charges on the bill. So our average bill, let's call it $110. Only $8.75 of that is paying for the garden hose, right? Now there's other fixed costs for serving residential customers, because it's all the way upstream with our generation, our transmission and distribution utilities, assets and facilities. But we can't bill customers with a $65 base charge and $40 worth of energy charges. That's not intuitive for customers, because they're used to paying as they use something. They pay for the quantity that they use. If we did that, if we had a bill that had a $65 monthly base fixed charge on it, well, then somebody could get solar and we would be completely indifferent. Their bill would go from $110 down to $70. They'd still be paying $65 of fixed costs, but their new bill is only $5 of variable cost, because they're filling the pool with a well that they drilled. Does that make sense?
Sure, but does it matter to us, being the generation facility?
Well, I guess I would say the extent to which they're paying for the fixed cost that we incur to serve them very much matters to us.
I think I disagree that the customer wouldn't understand if we explained the difference, because my analogy would be, I operate my vehicle. I paid $25,000 for my Toyota truck, and my variable cost of gas is whatever my gasoline is. Well, I had a large fixed cost to get my truck. Well, so I think consumers can understand if we explain to them that there's this large fixed cost of setting up an infrastructure, of being able to provide electricity. So I don't know that I agree that they wouldn't understand that. I think it takes education, but they could still understand that we may need to charge a higher fixed cost.
Sure, I totally agree. But I mean, my question was that how is that set in the rates, and how does that affect the cost that we're talking about at CPS? We have fixed costs and we have to pay our bills. And when this happens, then how do you set the rates on that when somebody has the same kind of truck as you say, and it doesn't use as much gas?
So let's do this, team. I think let's let Augie keep going, because we're not going to get through everything if we don't let him keep going. But I promise you, as we get to looking at CPS Energy's situation through this lens, we will lay out our rates and how they relate to variable and fixed costs.
Yeah, no, sounds good. I think just one comment I had on, maybe I shouldn't say this because it'll continue the conversation going, but if you have less kilowatt hours, and that's generating the fixed cost, then eventually your energy charge will increase. And so those who continue to consume as much kilowatt hour as before would in some sense be paying an additional amount for the lost kilowatt hours from solar PV. At the same time, however, it's not only solely PV that results in less kilowatt hours, it's a lot of things. It's like energy efficiency and demand management and things like that. But from a cost allocation perspective, it would, I'll show you that in the slides, it would then increase kind of the kilowatt hour rate because you have a lower denominator recovering your energy costs and the fixed cost component that's being recovered through your kilowatt hour charge. And the last slide in the presentation shows that kind of rate design perspective. Okay, so if I go now to the next slide, and so there's 3 steps of electricity rate making: revenue requirement, cost of service, and rate design. And this is the question was asked earlier about what kind of cost are we talking about? So when you do a cost of service study, many times you begin with the revenue requirement and then you do your cost of service study. And the basis of the cost of service study is to take the revenue requirement and allocate it. Other times, the steps between revenue requirement and cost of service are combined. And when someone refers to a cost of service study, they're really referring to both a revenue requirement and a cost of service analysis. And I think CPS is more in line with that combination of the two. But in a traditional rate making, you start with the revenue requirement, and the question is, how much revenue should the utility be permitted to earn? Right, so that's like a fundamental question. And because we don't have a competitive market, we have to have some basis upon determining how much revenue prices a utility can charge. How much is too much and how much is too little. So that's the basic, first step of a revenue requirement analysis. In general, the answer to that is a utility company under US rate regulation is provided a reasonable opportunity. A reasonable opportunity. That means they're not guaranteed, but it's a reasonable opportunity to recover its prudently incurred cost. So the costs have to be prudently incurred, right? There's got to be some, some efficiency in terms of the costs that are incurred. Nothing extravagant. If there's any kind of affiliated interactions, those have got to be at arm's length transactions, and so on and so forth. But somebody has to judge whether the costs being incurred by the utility are prudent and efficient. But in general, the type of cost that we're talking about, like a company like CPS, we're talking about the capital expenditures for generation, transmission, distribution, meters, billing systems, operation and maintenance expenses, generation, again, transmission, distribution. These all have their own operation and maintenance, fuel expense and purchase power, administrative and general expenses like office building, legal, human resource, executive, the taxes, and then the payment to the city. These are all the components of the revenue requirement. And what a cost of service study does, the goal is to take that revenue requirement and allocate that, and I'm using the word allocate to mean a couple things that'll become obvious after a couple slides, allocate that to the different customer groups, usually residential, industrial, and commercial. So that's the first step of the rate making, the revenue requirement. If you go on to the next slide, the second high level step is the cost of service study, the cost of service model, which is to identify, summarize, and allocate costs to the different customer classes. And this is the basis of what we'll be talking about over the next few slides. Basically, how much of the revenue requirement should residential, commercial, industrial customers be responsible for, what is fair, and a cost of service model adopts a certain methodology, a certain approach to answer those questions. And if you go on to the next slide, and the third step is what we started talking about a couple weeks ago, and which we'll continue to talk about, which is rate design, which is turning the allocated costs to the different customer groups, turning those into rates. And things like, should Should the customer pay a flat charge? Should the charges vary with usage? Should there be blocks? Should there be charges that vary by time of use, vary by season? Should the customer have a demand charge? Demand charges are not common in residential. They're very common for larger customers. If you do a demand charge, what should be the hour of the day that you charge them, or the hour of the month, or the hour of the year? The 1 peak period, 1 hour peak period, or a combination of hours? In order to answer those questions, rate design, the cost of service model gives the rate design expert those inputs that allow that rate design person to kind of look at and see, okay, here's what the rates would look like if I have this kind of type of rate design. But whatever rate design you have, it should recover only the allocated cost to each customer group and in total. So rate design in general, it's not like if you change rate design, you're going to get additional revenues. Each rate design is meant to recover the revenue requirement and the revenue requirement that's been allocated to the different customer groups. So if you go to the next slide, this gives kind of gives a picture of these steps. Again, hypothetical examples. Start with the revenue requirement. In this example, it's $1 billion. Some entity, a regulator, has to have approved. Yes, those are prudently incurred costs. Those are efficient costs. That's the basis upon the rates. And so once you agree with the revenue requirement, you're kind of saying that that's a just and reasonable basis for rate making. Then the cost of service study, which selects a certain type of costing methodology. There could be different types of costing methodology one uses. That is what allocates the revenue requirement to the different customer classes. And then the last step is the rate design, which for each customer class, you decide questions like, are you going to have a demand charge, or you're not going to have a demand charge? Are you going to have inclining block, declining block? Are you going to have time of use? Things like that. So that is, at a high level, the steps in rate making. And in the slides that follow, we'll be focusing in on the middle part, which is the cost of service study. So let me just go to the next slide and pause there to see if there's any high-level questions or specific questions on that part. Okay.
Sorry for I guess, at the risk of asking this question too early, back on slide 12, you showed the rate design methodology leading to those 4 blocks at the very bottom, the 4 blocks within the bottom block in blue. Is this where we have the option or the essentially flexibility to design those 4 different blocks for different customer classes? Or, I mean, is that what we're doing? Is that what we're heading to? Sorry if I'm asking this ahead of time.
No, that's perfect. If you go back to the slide, the previous slide, slide 12, please. Yes. So this rate design methodology, for each class, you can kind of say, okay, what is the rate design going to look like? And yes, at the end of the presentation, I'll touch upon this briefly, but this is a separate standalone exercise. This is what Ahmed was lecturing about a couple weeks ago and even a month ago, where there's lots of examples in the United States and around the world how companies and regulators are doing rate design for their customer classes. In some sense, that's really independent of cost of service. You need the cost of service as inputs to give you the specific costs that are turned into rate. But it is, many view that as a standalone exercise, that it needs the cost of service as the inputs, but you can do a standalone rate design for each customer class based on what the costs are that have been allocated to those classes.
Okay. All right. Thanks. Appreciate it.
Sure.
Hey, Augie, just a time check. I think our community input is 7:15, is that right, Ann?
Yes, yes.
So we've got about 45 minutes.
Okay.
Hate to rush you, but I'm going to rush you a little bit.
Okay, no problem. Okay, so if we go to the next slide. So probably like the next 10 slides are kind of the heart of the cost of service analysis. There's three main steps of a study, a cost of service study. One is what we call the functionalization of the revenue requirement. The second is the classification of the revenue requirement. And the third is the allocation of the revenue requirement. The functionalization is just splitting up the revenue requirement into the different functions: generation, transmission, distribution, and customer. Classification is what we've talked about already, taking the revenue requirement and saying what part of the revenue requirement is energy related, what part is demand related, and what part is customer related. And that's the basis of our energy rate, our demand rate, and our customer rate, or cost really. And then the last part is, okay, once I have the energy component of the revenue requirement, how much of that should go to the different customer classes? So we'll cover these in the next about 10 slides. Next slide, please. Same slide as before, functionalization. The first step is, taking the revenue requirement and saying how much of it is generation, how much of it is transmission, how much is distribution, how much is customers. And when we mean customer, we're talking about the meter, billing systems, things like that. This is primarily an accounting exercise, although sometimes you can get into some serious litigated issues about whether an asset should be transmission or distribution, because it does affect rates that some customers pay. This is more relevant in kind of wholesale transmission services that regulated by the FERC for the most part. But in general, in a cost of service study, this is just an accounting exercise that you kind of look at. And if you go to the next slide, the end result of that accounting exercise could be, oh, look, the revenue requirement in this example is about 1.3 billion. 870 of that about is generation assets or production. As I mentioned before, the largest part usually is generation. Then you have distribution, and then you have transmission and customer. Distribution and customer are sometimes dealt with together. But this is kind of, what comes out of the functionalization part of the cost of service study. And again, it's usually not controversial. It's straightforward, but there are exceptions. Next slide, please. And we have a question and answer session here for functionalization. If anybody has a question, we can deal with it. Now we can just go on to the next stage, which is classification. So the next stage is the classification stage of the cost of service study. And again, we should be familiar. We know what an energy cost is, what a demand cost is, and what a customer cost is. And what we want to do is now we just functionalize the revenue requirement to production, transmission, and distribution. And now we want to split that into these components. What amount of that revenue requirement is energy, what amount is demand, and what amount is customer. And to do that, for the most part, it's also an accounting exercise with some exceptions. So sometimes there's some additional analysis that needs to be done. But at a high level, anything related to fuel, purchase power, and what we call variable O&M is termed energy. Anything that's capital investment, capital related, is termed demand. And then meter reading, billing, collection, all those are customer components. So if you go to the next slide, we have, after we've done our classification approach, we might have something like this, where the generation revenue requirement is now broken down between a demand-related portion, which is the capital assets, and then an energy-related portion, which is the fuel cost for the most part. Transmission is mostly demand-related. There's some exceptions. And then on the distribution side, you have that broken into a demand-related component and a customer-related component. Okay. And again, you'll see now that we now have components in place. Eventually, that energy charge is going to be based on the production energy-related revenue requirement. In this example, is 396 million. So 396 million would be the basis of an energy cost. The last thing we have to do, which we do in the allocation stage, is allocate that energy revenue requirement between the different customer classes. And that's the last step of what we need to do. And we would do that for the demand-related cost and the customer-related cost. So if you can go to the next slide. Yeah, so this is if there's any questions on this part of the yeah, there's a question about provide an example how a cost of service study can incorporate an equitable cost allocation principle within the residential class in light of potential increase fixed rate conversation earlier in the meeting. I think that's a very good question. It's probably going to be a pretty detailed question. I would argue in light of time, if we can hold that, and I'd like to get back to that question if we have time at the end of this presentation, or if not, at the beginning of another presentation. I want to get into, is there a cost of service methodology that is more equitable than another? Understanding that the ultimate goal of a cost of service methodology, or one ultimate goal in terms of just and reasonable rates, is cost causation. Okay. But I think I will get a little bit to that throughout this presentation, but I'd like to kind of come back to that at a high level, because I think that's going to be a very important part going forward. We go on to the next slide. Okay, so the last part is, we've got like this energy revenue requirement. How do we determine how much of that energy revenue requirement the residential class should pay? We have a demand revenue requirement. How much of that demand revenue requirement should the residential or industrial customer pay? Same thing for the customer-related revenue requirement. And basically the principle, if customer class A causes more of the revenue requirement to be incurred than customer class B, then customer class A should be responsible for more of the revenue requirement than customer class B. The general principle widely accepted as the basis for cost of service study. So it's cost causation. If you cause more cost, you should be responsible for paying more of the revenue requirement. And as I mentioned earlier, most of the facilities in electricity systems, such as generation, plant, transmission, are used by all customer classes. So we have to, they're what we call common facilities. So how do we allocate the cost of these common facilities to each customer class? And the way we do that is we look at each customer's class usage. The more you use this an asset, the more you should be responsible for paying for it. The less you use the asset, the less you should be responsible for paying for it. So we've already talked about a couple measures of usage previously: kilowatt hour, kilowatt, and customer. And those three measures are the basis of coming up with what we call allocation factors that we use to allocate the revenue requirement to the different customer classes. So if we go to the next slide. Okay, what do we see here? So in order to come up with an allocation factor, a company like CPS or other utilities will do something called load research. They want to see how the different customer classes are consuming energy throughout a period. In the example to the left, it's the customer usage by class over a 24-hour period during the peak day. And this peak day could be the hottest day in the summer, coldest day in the winter. But this shows us how the system changes throughout the day and what the peak hour for the system is. In this particular example, it's hour number 17. So 5 o'clock in the afternoon on this day, could have been in August or sometime, was the hour with the highest peak of the system. So we want to then look at, okay, how much of that peak was caused by the residential class? How much of that peak was caused by the SGS is a small general service, MGS is a medium general service, and GS is large general service. So we want to know how much of that total system peak was proportionally attributed to the different customer classes. And in this example, again, made up numbers, 51%, the allocation factor for the residential class, 51% of the total system peak was due to the residential class. So we would assign or allocate 51% of the cost in this example to the residential class, and 16% to the small general service, 25% for the medium general service, and 13% for large general service. So that's the basis of how we do an allocation. Yes, general service, yes, includes commercial and industrial. Yeah, sometimes you have a general service 1, which is a rate based on like under 20 kilowatts, and then sometimes general service is between 20 kilowatts and 100 kilowatts, and so on. But yes, general service usually includes the commercial and industrial. So this is the allocation factor that we do, and we do one for those 3 components we have. We come up with an allocation for the energy revenue requirement. We come up with an allocation factor for the customer revenue requirement, and we come up with an allocation factor for the demand revenue requirement. And I do that in the next 3 slides. Next slide, please. Okay, so here is the energy related cost. The energy related cost is what we talked about before. So we say, let's say there was $100 million was energy related, was the cost. And now we need to allocate that cost among the different customer classes. And the way we do that is, okay, what was the total amount of kilowatt hours sold throughout the year? In this example is 18 billion. And again, just straightforward, how much of that was sold to the residential class? How much of that was sold to the small general service class? How much of that was sold to the medium general service and in the large general service? And in this example, again, hypothetical numbers, the residential class purchased about 40% of the total kilowatt hours in the system. So they would be allocated 40% of the energy revenue requirement. If you go to the next slide, we're coming up with an allocation factor for the customer class. And for the customer cost, for the customer cost, there's usually 2 ways of doing it. You can come up with an allocation factor based on the total number of customers, and that's what the 3rd column has. But that one usually is not done because it's unfair, because it tends to provide not enough of the cost to the large general service, because most of the costs here involve like meter cost. And if you just allocate based on number of customers, the large general service, although they're very large customers, they're very small in number. So it's more typical that we come up with an allocation factor based on a weighted average based on weighted by meter, which is what the 4th column here presents. Because that's just a little nuance on how to come up with an allocation factor for a customer cost. But in this example, about almost 80% of the customer cost would be assigned to the residential. And then the last slide, the next slide, deals with the demand revenue requirement. and how to allocate the demand revenue requirement to the different customer classes. And here is where you probably get into the most discussion, debate, disagreements, litigation of how demand-related costs should be allocated to the different customer classes. And there are many different type of methodologies. We can go into detail later on, not in this presentation, but in general, if people are interested in more information about that. But this becomes the basis upon allocating the demand cost to the different customer classes based on some measure of how much peak responsibility a customer class has, or other methodologies that one might use. In this particular example, again, it's hypothetical, but the allocation methodology resulted in the residential class resulting in about 54%, being allocated about 54% of the demand-related revenue requirement. And I think the next slide. So the next two slides wrap it up. And this slide specifically here has the basis of turning these costs into costs for the specific customer groups. So over here we have, if we're just focused on energy, for example, the total revenue requirement of energy was 396 million. We developed those energy allocator factors. We applied those energy allocator factors, and in so doing, we found that the residential class has to recover or is responsible for $174 million of that energy revenue requirement. Same thing for the other components, the demand component and the customer component. We have the total amount of those costs. We've developed the allocation factors, and those allocation factors then result in how much each customer class should be responsible for when we develop their rates. Okay, so we can turn the energy component in the final 4 slides of this presentation. We'll use these numbers to turn these energy rates, demand costs, and customer costs into specific rates for these customer classes. And if you go to the next slide is just summing up at a high level what amount of the total revenue requirement after we've done all this does the residential class pay for, the small general service class pay for, medium and large. And in this hypothetical example, the residential class is responsible for about 55% of the revenue requirement, and then small general service is 20%, medium general service is 10%, and large general service is 15%. Now this last statement here, I think is incredibly important. Some people might ask, why is that the case? Well, there's no single reason why that is the case. There are many steps in a cost of service study and different approaches and methodologies that drive the final results. So yes, as I think as Peter mentioned earlier, are there different cost allocation methodologies? Yes, there are many different type of cost allocation methodologies, and it's important to kind of understand the difference between those, why they're different, what the reason is for them. Are there any that get into kind of issues of equity or equitable, what's more equitable? But when one asks, why is this the case, there's not one single answer. It's the totality of the approach, the way that the costs were functionalized, the way that the costs were classified, and then the way that the costs were allocated. If you go, so the next slide, I think, is a question and discussion. And then I think we just have, yeah.
Augie?
Yes, go ahead.
I do have a couple of questions, but I want to reserve them. They don't really disturb the flow, because I want us to get to the point where you can end up and we can take the public comments. And if we have time, we'll come back.
Okay.
I do have 1 or 2, just clarifications mostly.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, so we have 4 slides to go, and I think after that we'll have then time for some additional Q&A. Okay, so if you go to the next slide. So here, these last 4 slides are turning the allocated energy cost to the different residential customers that we just did, turning those into energy rates, energy cost per customer class. And so what we have here, the third column, these numbers are, they come from the previous slides. And so specifically, the residential class was allocated $174 million. And their consumption was about 7 billion kilowatt hours. So the energy rate for the residential class is just B divided by A, which turns out to be 2.4 cents per kilowatt hour. And then we just had some assumption about the average monthly use per customer, per residential customer, and that's the basis of the bill. So for the residential class, the typical bill based on this profile would be $22.41. And you do the same thing for all the customer classes. And you see, for example, the large general service customer has $73 million allocated to it. It's got 3.9 billion in kilowatt hours. And that results in a charge of about 1.9 cents per kilowatt hour. Now they have much more average energy per month, so their bill obviously is much higher. But the approach is the same. And you see in this example, the energy rate for all customer classes is relatively close. You got 1.9 cents to 2.4 cents, more or less. Typically, that's not the case, and the last slide shows why it's not the case. Typically, the residential kilowatt hour charges is significantly higher than the large general service charge, and there's always a question of why is that the case and is that fair? But there's a specific reason why that's the case, and the last slide shows why that's the reason. But if you go to the next slide, we do the same type of analysis now for the 2 remaining cost components, the customer cost component, and then the slide after this will be the demand cost component. So for the customer cost component, again, for the residential class, it was allocated 153 million. We went through the steps of how it was allocated. There's about 650,000 residential customers. So the annual customer charge would be 153 million divided by 650,000. But it's typical to put a monthly customer charge. And so we divide that by 12 and get around, for the residential class, around $20 per customer. You can see there the large general service customer has a much higher customer charge because they have usually much more sophisticated and more expensive meters. Okay, and then if you go to the next chart, next slide, the final cost category, the demand component, the demand cost, we also turn that into a demand rate or a demand cost. For the residential customer, it was allocated 393 million. It's got a demand of about 3.2 million kilowatts. And so if we turn that into a demand rate per kilowatt per month, that turns out to be about $10. So if you have a typical monthly demand for a residential customer of 5, that results in about $50 in a demand charge for a residential customer. And you do the same thing for all the other customer classes, and you get a specific demand rate. Now, here's the reality is that, as we said, most residential customers and even small general service customers do not have a demand charge. So the question is, as you see there, the residential allocated demand cost, 393 million, what happens to that? If we don't have a demand charge for that, for the residential class, where is that, where are those costs going to be recovered from? And usually the energy kilowatt hour charge, that's typically. Sometimes part of that can be assigned to the customer charge as well, and you could play around with both. But in the next slide, I have, what I've done is I've taken the entire allocated demand costs for each of the customer classes and added that to the energy cost and divided by the energy kilowatt hour to come up with a new kilowatt hour charge. Because, the 393 million has to be recovered somewhere. It can either be recovered, if you're not going to have a demand charge, it can either be recovered through the energy charge or the customer charge or some combination of the two. But in this example, if you go to the next slide, if you go to, so here, the entire amount of the demand cost for the residential class and the small class, that is recovered through the energy rate. So when we do that, you see now the residential energy rate, it was, I think, around 2.4 cents per kilowatt hour. It's now increased to 8 cents per kilowatt hour. And the small general service was also around 2 cents per kilowatt hour. It's now increased to almost 6 cents per kilowatt hour. In this particular example, the total bill doesn't change. So if I had a demand charge for the residential class, I still would have been recovering $92.55 over the entire amount. So in a static kind of sense, it doesn't affect. But as we were talking about earlier, when you start talking about reducing your consumption of kilowatt hours and what impact that has, well, when you reduce your kilowatt hour consumption, part of the kilowatt hour consumption that it was recovering was not only the energy rate, but now in this example, the $396 million of the demand cost. It's the same thing with the small general service. When you have no demand charge, it's got to recover those demand costs from someplace. And in the final, so in this particular example, the medium general service and the large general service do have a demand charge. So what you would see in the medium general service and large general service is kind of an ideal rate structure, whereas this issue about, in the medium general service, if the medium general service reduces its consumption by 10%, it's perfectly fine from the utility perspective, because all of his fixed costs through the demand rate and the monthly customer charge are recovered through separate rates. So those fixed costs are still going to be recovered. And anytime the medium general service or the large general service reduces its consumption, the utility avoids certain costs. It avoids those variable costs. So it's perfectly indifferent in terms of whether whether the customer reduces kilowatt hour consumptions or not. So this here kind of, I think, is an incredibly important, concept to understand in terms of, what the challenges are in today's electricity rate making based on this particular concept. If you go to the next slide, I think it's the last one, which is the question and discussion. And we can talk about now anything throughout the entire presentation, not just this last section.
So turn back to 32 for just a minute, Adrian. Augie ended with a really, really key critical point, and I just want to put some emphasis on it again. This issue of putting fixed cost recovery into the variable charges on a customer's bill, that is just fine to do as long as the volume that we sell is predictable and stable. But the minute any customer, whether it's a residential or a commercial customer, does something unexpected, like all of a sudden they're not using the same number of kilowatt hours from us, from the utility, it breaks that model. So that is the problem that all utilities on the face of the earth are trying to solve in a way that makes sense for customers.
Yeah, and it becomes particularly, why wasn't this a problem like 30 or 40 years ago? I mean, it was always a problem for some economists because it's a mismatch between your rates and your costs. So some economists have always been advocating this for a long time. But it's become problematic recently because you've had technological change and customers being able to self-produce and consume on their own, or for a certain amount or a significant amount of their electricity needs. That and the goal for more energy efficiency, all those are relatively newer concepts if you're thinking about new in terms of the recent decade or two, not the last century or so.
Can I ask my question?
Yes, sure.
Okay. Now, the question is, or more like the clarification is on page 21. That's the cost allocation. I guess I call it page 21, not PDF page 21, but
This
that
one?
yes, this one, yes. And the third bullet there talks about the issue of demand, peak periods of demand. And my keyword there is demand, and I think it also relates back to this demand charge that we were talking about just a few minutes ago. In one of our previous meetings, I believe the term was size of pipe. Am I correct? Okay. And
Yeah.
that made me think, just because of my background, of what happens with our water supply system. And so I wanted you to please maybe clarify that analogy with water, because one of the things that I think happens on the water rates side, which I've actually had the opportunity to attend a few of the meetings, is that typically with some of the industrial customers, they typically have a very somewhat steady demand over time, meaning that the range over which they operate is sort of tighter.
Right.
Whereas for the residential customers, the range typically goes, there's a wider range, but you have to size your pipe for the peak flow, which is equivalent to that peak instantaneous demand you talked about. Does that play a significant role in raising what would be the rates by way of fixed costs to residential relative to larger industrial customers who, as I said, have a narrower range of demand? I mean, does that make sense? I guess you see where I'm heading to, but it's that size of pipe I'm trying to clarify.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense, and it is analogous. So in the electricity, it's very similar, that you can think of the size of the pipe being, how much does, say, like a residential customer demand at the peak period. Same thing with industrial, and same thing with commercial. And it's been the case, and not always, that the measure of peak demand that they use to allocate cost is like the 1 hour of the year where you have the most demand, right? So that kind of gets to the system of the pipe. Now, usually the large industrial groups like that. They like that approach because why? Because they, as you said, they have a much higher utilization factor. They tend to use electricity more evenly throughout the year. So their peak demand tends not to be as peaky, if that's the word, as a residential customer whose utilization, which the term is called the load factor. That's the term for utilization. The residential customer's load factor tends to be lower. So when you apply a 1 CP, a 1 critical peak, as the allocator for allocating demand costs, it's usually going to benefit the larger customers because their usage is more constant throughout the year. So in that sense, I do see a similarity with water. Now, the one difference is that there's a lot of other methodologies. There's like, well, don't do it just on the 1 critical peak hour, but how about an average of the 4 yearly critical peak periods, or an average of the 12 monthly critical peak periods, or other hours, because in electricity, which is a little bit different than water for the most part, is another important measure is not only how big your pipe is, but it's also reliability. Is that you want your system to be very reliable. And although having, maximum capacity that you need for meeting the peak hour is important, there's other hours in the year that can also be very important for reliability. So some allocation methodologies take additional hours into account as well and say, look, let me look at the hours of the year that have the highest probability of problems occurring, and let me do an allocation factor based upon those hours of the year as well. So those are some initial thoughts of your question.
Augie, turn to the next slide, because this is that concept visually. The top line is the total system, like everybody aggregated together, we have to build our system to satisfy that top point. So if you think about a horizontal line that's just laid across the top of that from left to right, we have to build a system for that line. But there's periods of the day when our system is overbuilt because it's not being fully utilized. So the lines below that sort of unpack the different customer types that are contributing to that, you know, highly peaky line. The residential are the purple one, right? That's the one right below. So you can see that they're more peaky. And then you start getting into the business and the commercial segments that are more flat lines at the bottom. So if you got a flat line, you have a high load factor, you're a high utilization rate, you're high, you know, high efficiency. That's why we charge them a lower price per kilowatt hour, because we can defer the cost differently, right? So residential also has to pay for the periods of time when they're being really inefficient. That's another way to look at it.
Yeah, I just add to that. Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, go ahead. I was just going to say I had a quick question before we move into our public comments.
Oh, okay. Yeah, just real quick, that's the fundamental problem in electricity. You've got this peak, you got to invest all this to meet the peak, but then during other periods of the time, you know, you're operating at maybe at half of that capacity. And unlike water or gas, you have no storage. So that exacerbates this particular problem. So this has been kind of the problem of electricity rate making since the beginning. The issue of storage now starts to complicate that in a good way, in a sense, the fundamentals of electricity costing.
Anita, go ahead. What's your question?
Thank you. Well, I want to say all of this has been very helpful today. And I'm trying to get my words correct so I can ask this video in an articulate, or ask this question in an articulate manner. So really what I started thinking about learning all of this information today was, you know, earlier, I think, Chad, you kind of shared with us on the side that excluding our fuel costs, that generation is roughly 66%, transmission is roughly 4%, distribution about 27%, and then the customer cost is about 3% of that. Earlier, we learned that obviously here in San Antonio, specifically with CPS Energy, that our cost of service model is built upon our pillars of fairness and equity, affordability, sustainability, like renewable energy, which we have been working very hard on and progressing. So part of our climate plan, and financial stability, which again is one of the, as equally a very important part of it. My question is this: as we move forward, understanding that some of this has always been built within those costs that we mentioned earlier, those percentages, you know, I think kind of our new challenge that I do think we should begin to think about and discuss is preparedness for the extreme weather events, and what may need to happen or may need to change moving forward, because our world is changing, and that's, I know, a much bigger issue than just CPS Energy for a variety of reasons. But I just have to wonder how much that will impact us moving forward in terms of evaluating our rates and our rate structure. And so I guess that's a very general question. You know, again, I kind of think about, I realize that it's built into it, pieces of that have always been built into it. I think it's going to have to go to the next level. Obviously, you know, I think that's no secret. But when I think about our pillars of fairness and equity, affordability, sustainability, financial stability, renewable energy, preparedness seems like it needs to emerge as another pillar, so to speak.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting observation, and I do want to correct myself. I think what Augie was showing did have the variable fuel costs, and that's one reason why generation is such a large percentage. But you know, as we harden the system, as we do weatherization activities, whether it's at the power plants or on the transmission lines or on the distribution assets, those investments are fixed cost investments. And so it will change the equation, but it's sort of directionally the same as it is, right? Where we have this problem that we're having to invest fixed costs, and we got to charge the customer accordingly.
And I think that was what was so such a big moment for me, was when you talked about our key point, and that if we include those fixed costs as a part of our variable cost to customers, the impact of that if they don't use that anticipated demand. Again, I mean, I think it's such a hard question, and because at the end of the day, it will be the people of San Antonio that have to bear these costs, and so yeah, thank you so much. It's just something, that again, I think about. I know we all are thinking about that. So thank you.
Okay, Chad, and I think it's getting pretty close to starting the public comment. Augie, very good job. I appreciate, Chad, you keeping up with the questions. I think we only have really one longer question outstanding. To Anita's point, we will have lots of discussion, obviously, on dealing with these fixed costs that we've got, and actually trying to figure out whether those will be there'll be more fixed costs put into the rates or not, and as opposed to trying to recuperate them from a variable process. So, Ann, I guess we were about ready to turn it over to public comments, unless there's anything else someone might have real quick. All right, let's move into the public comment if we can.
Okay, I think we only have one speaker that has actually signed on now. So Adrian, if you would unmute Dr. McGuire, please, sir.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you, Ann, and thank you, Reed. Dr. McGuire, you will now be unmuted to provide your public input.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, I'm going to move quickly into this rather than an introduction of myself. I've already spoken to you earlier. In their first presentation, Brattle mentioned several important ways by which major improvements in our electric grid are being accomplished. Those improvements are essential for San Antonio to be able to cope with impacts of climate change that are endangering people's lives and can destroy whole towns and disabled cities' electric grids. We must address these very real threats that are occurring even now. Number one, CPS Energy's existing rate structure fails to promote energy efficiency and conservation because the heaviest users in all classes get significant reduction in the cost of kilowatt hours. There needs to be a way that those heaviest users, for example, a data center that uses more than 7 million kilowatt hours a month, have an incentive to invest in energy efficiency for their processes, such as the data center's IT equipment, which may be very energy inefficient, and they're building, for example, an older air conditioning system that uses more than twice the amount of energy that a newer system would use. So as Brattle's publications have demonstrated, significant increases in energy efficiency and general conservation practices can dramatically save costs, including the cost of building new production facilities and increasing capacity. Number two, CPS Energy's existing rate structure fails to promote rapid investment in distributed energy resources, such as on-site solar arrays where there could be minimal loss of energy and transmission to where it is used, and especially battery storage and the creation of microgrids right here in San Antonio. Number three, CPS Energy's existing rate structure fails to promote enough attention to reducing peak demand because it defines peak demand as non-coincident peak usage. CPS Energy's number 4, CPS Energy's existing rate structure fails to provide energy equity because it bases residential and commercial volumetric prices on average amounts of usage. But since customers that use the least amounts of kilowatt hours, CPS may be getting more revenue from that definition, but it fails to get the value of reducing peak demand that could lead to system failure. Number 5, CPS Energy's existing rate structure is prolonging the closure of its 2 coal-fired power plants that are causing significant health problems and increasing the greenhouse gases that lead to further, faster bringing on climate change to the point of deadly climate change. So I'm very, very concerned. I would like to see much more attention paying to how the rate structure promotes the right kinds of energy efficiency, et cetera. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. McGuire. Reed, that was our last virtual speaker. The other registered virtual speaker has not joined yet.
Okay, let's give them a minute or two. We've got some time here. If folks have some follow-up questions, let's try to use our time until this one more individual comes on. It is after 7:15, so perhaps they've just decided not to speak, but it does give us a chance to open the floor up. If anyone has anything or any questions or any, for this point, as far as I'm concerned, any comments.
Reed, I think Dee Dee had a couple of comments.
Well, then, Dee Dee, you got the floor.
Thanks a lot. I don't know if Dr. McGuire is still on, but wanted to thank her for her comments and her questions. She brings up, she's not just thoughtful, but quite expert on rate structure. So I appreciate her comments, and I know we don't have time to address the questions or some of the comments that she made, but I'm hoping that at some point we can, because she's a customer and she's part of the public, that we are addressing some of the remarks that she made in some capacity. I know that what she is saying is very specific to CPS Energy versus like what we're looking at are some, case studies or some hypotheticals that were presented today. But I do hope that we're taking note of what Dr. McGuire commented on, and that we can address it sometime as we get closer to talking specifically about CPS Energy's rate structure, because she makes good points. Like we should be incentivizing conservation, and we should be looking at heavier users and how we structure our rates around that. But she brings out excellent points. So that's it.
I agree with you. Thank you very much, Dee Dee. While we have a minute, this whole issue of fixed versus variable costs, whether you want to call it energy or demand. Chad, if you want to jump in here and give us any thoughts on new concepts that y'all are looking at or anything, we've got a few minutes, and I know this has been very well teed up and explained by Augie. If you had any comments, Chad, it'd be great to listen.
Well, thanks for the opportunity. I guess I would just say that this is going to be a journey. The utilities that have addressed this problem have done so over a period of time. We've talked a lot recently about what the fall of this year looks like for us and the possibility of a rate adjustment. We're not going to be able to fix everything in one go. And so what we'll talk about in coming weeks is, where do we think we will go long term, and then where do we think we can go short term? There's some decisions that are easier to make in the immediate term, very, very near term, like maybe we increase our fixed charges a little bit. The longer term decisions, not even super long, but medium term, longer term decisions are, well, do we incorporate a time of use rate? That's a much more advanced structure, but it's a different approach. So we are considering those. So one of the things we'll talk about either 2 weeks or 4 weeks from now is some of the electric vehicle price tests that we are running. We have a time of use rate for superchargers, so DC, what we call DC fast chargers. There's a Electrify America station that's over off of Thousand Oaks, I believe, and then there's several Tesla locations. One is over at Huebner Oaks. I pointed like y'all could see me pointing, and those are big systems, right? And so we are assessing charges to Tesla and Electrify America based on the timing with which customers show up and charge their vehicles, because it has an impact on the system and it changes the fixed cost equation. So we are evaluating that. We're in the next several months, hopefully we will launch a residential time of use pilot. It's targeted at electric vehicle owners and provides them a reward for shifting consumption from that peak period to the off-peak period. So they can program their car chargers to only charge at night. And what that does is it sort of fills in the valley next to that peak that we were looking at on the slide just a second ago. So we're piloting that stuff, and we're going to work with the community to implement it. But we got to think both short term and long term, I guess, is what I would say.
All right, thank you, Chad. Well, I appreciate everybody's attention tonight. I don't have anything else unless Eloisa does. We're just going to sign off. But Eloisa, comments?
No, I have no comments. Thank you so much, everybody.
All right, well, thanks so much, Augie. I really appreciate the presentation. Next week, I guess, Chad, you'll be on point with this one, and we're now going to kind of shift gears into CPS specific calculations, if I understand your program, Chad. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. What our plan is to sort of, through the CPS Energy lens, back up 3 meetings where in late June, we had the discussion around rate objectives. So we'll start with that. How do we view our rate design objectives? And then we'll talk about the rate designs and how that sort of works into those objectives. And we will also show how that relates to our cost structure. So we'll kind of mirror the flow of the last 3 meetings, and we're going to try and do it as expeditiously as possible. So my hope is to do that in the next meeting. That may bleed over into the meeting after that. But then my hope is the next meeting, so August 5th is our next meeting, and that's where I want to cover the material I just summarized. August 19th, 2 weeks after that, I'm trying to reserve for deep dives into specific topics. So solar, affordability, equity, et cetera.
Okay. Well, that sounds good. That gives everybody a heads up as to where we're going. Appreciate everybody's attention tonight. And if there's nothing else, y'all having a good evening.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. Have a nice night.
Good night. Thank you.